It is late. Not late like you should still be answering emails. Late like the world has stopped talking. Late like even your thoughts are yawning. Now imagine a coastline, a dark sea, and a city that still has a pulse, even at midnight. This is Alexandria. You can almost see it before you fully see it. Little lamps along the harbor, warm dots of light, like someone spilled a necklace into the night. The waves roll in and out, slow and steady, not in a hurry, like they have all the time in the world. And somewhere behind the harbor, past the noise of sailors and carts and tired footsteps, there is another kind of quiet. A quiet that belongs to rooms, to columns, to indoor air that smells like papyrus, oil lamps, and ink. In your mind, you may already picture it. A huge building, tall doors, endless shelves, a single place where all knowledge sits politely in rows, waiting to be rescued. That picture is powerful. It is also a bit suspicious, because this story is not just about a library. It is about a dream, and about how dreams get messy when they meet real life, real politics, real fires, and real humans. But don't worry, we are not here to speedrun history like it's a video game. No loud drama, no scary music, just calm steps and careful facts. Tonight, we will do something simple. We will walk through what we know, and what we think, and what people love to repeat because it sounds amazing. And we'll do it gently. No shame. The myths are part of the story too. They just don't get to drive the car. Picture a scroll in your hands. Not a modern book with neat pages. A scroll is different. It unrolls like a slow breath. It asks you to be patient. You hold the wooden rods. You pull just a little. The papyrus whispers, soft, dry, like a secret trying not to wake anyone. And as the scroll opens, you can imagine the words inside. Math, poems, maps, medicine, arguments in the margins, small corrections, a note from someone who thought, no, that line is wrong, and had to prove it. And now in your mind, the famous image appears. The library burning, flames, smoke, scrolls turning to ash, a whole world of knowledge disappearing in one horrible night. It is a strong image. It sticks in the brain like a song you didn't ask for. And you will find it everywhere. In documentaries, in novels, in memes, sometimes even in serious conversations. But here is the first quiet question. Did it really burn in one night? And another question. Was it even one building? And one more, because your brain is allowed to be curious even while it gets sleepy. If it was so important, why would it be so easy to destroy? These questions matter. Not because we want to ruin the mood, but because the real story is better than the simple version. It is stranger. It is longer. And it teaches a deeper lesson. The simple version is a lightning strike. One big moment. One big villain. One big loss. The real version is more like weather. Slow shift, mini storms, and long stretches where nobody notices what is being lost until it is gone. So let's set a calm rule for tonight. Whenever you hear a clean, perfect line like, "They burned the Library of Alexandria and lost all the world's knowledge," you pause. You breathe. You say softly, "Okay, show me the evidence." Not in a rude way. Not in a debate club way. More like you are checking a label on a jar before you eat it. Because history is full of jars with exciting labels. And sometimes the jar is real, but the label was added later. Now let's zoom out. Alexandria was not a sleepy town. It was a big, rich, busy city. Ships came in. Goods went out. Ideas moved around. People argued in the streets. People prayed in different ways. People lived close together and still felt far apart. In a city like that, knowledge is not a single thing sitting in one room. Knowledge is a network. It is people teaching people. It is copying texts. It is storing scrolls. It is sending letters. It is moving from hand to hand, city to city. So when we talk about the Library of Alexandria, we have to be careful. The name sounds like one solid object, like a giant treasure chest, but it may have been more like a system. a set of places, a community, a project that changed over time. And when things went wrong, they did not have to go wrong once. They could go wrong many times. Small losses, big losses, fire here, a war there, budget cut, a political purge, a change in leadership, a shift in priorities. That is not as dramatic as one big explosion, but it is more believable. And honestly, it is more relatable. Because most things in life don't fall apart in one night. They fall apart slowly, while everyone is busy. Even your phone battery does that. So here is what we are doing in this series. We are going to walk through the entire story. Not just the famous burning scene. Not just the one tragic day story. We will look at the early ambition, the collecting of scrolls, the scholars, the catalogs, the politics, the rivalries, and then later, the moments of damage and decline. And each time, we will sort it into two baskets. What we know, things we can support with solid sources and strong reasoning. And what becomes myth, stories that might be partly true, or might be later inventions, or might be real events glued to the wrong place. And we will do it calmly. No yelling false, like an angry game show host. Just a gentle maybe and a gentle not sure, when that is what the evidence deserves. Because the Library of Alexandria is not only a place, it is a symbol. It stands for a fear we all have, the fear that something beautiful can vanish. That knowledge can be fragile. That human memory can burn. And it also stands for a hope, the hope that we can collect, preserve, and share. That we can build places where learning is treated like a treasure. Tonight, as the waves keep breathing against the harbor, let's hold both truths. Yes, there was greatness. Yes, there was loss. But the loss was not a single, clean story. It was long. It was complicated. And it was human. Before we move on, let's do our first little ledger. Just a small one. Nothing heavy. What we know at a high level. Alexandria became a major center of learning in the ancient world. There was a serious effort over time to gather and organize texts there. The Library of Alexandria's story involves multiple periods, not just one event. What is myth or uncertain right now? That the entire library was destroyed in one night by one fire. That it was one single building with every book on earth inside. That one person, one order, or one moment explains everything. And that's enough for now. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the image of the harbor lights soften at the edges. In the next chapter, we step into the city itself. We ask a simple question. Why Alexandria? Why here? And why then? Keep the harbor behind you for a moment. Because to understand the Library of Alexandria, you first have to understand the city that wanted it. Alexandria was not an old city with centuries of dust in its corners. It was a planned city, a new idea built with confidence. Almost like someone looked at the map and said, okay, we're putting a star right here. It sat where land and sea meet. On one side, the Mediterranean. On the other, the Nile's green ribbon and the desert's wide silence. That location mattered. Cities don't become famous just by being pretty. They become famous by being useful. Alexandria was useful. Ships could reach it. Trade could pour in. Grain could move out. Money could gather there like water finding the lowest place. And when money gathers, people gather. And when people gather, stories and ideas show up too. Picture the streets in daylight. Stone underfoot, bright sun overhead. Vendors calling out, sailors smelling like salt, officials pretending they are not sweating. And languages mixing everywhere. Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and more. Not always peacefully, but always alive. This was a crossroads. And at night, it did not suddenly become silent. It simply got softer. You would still hear oars in the water. You would still hear a cartwheel complain. You would smell fish, smoke, and grain dust from the storehouses. The city would feel like it was breathing in its sleep. Not fully awake, not fully gone. Kind of like you're right now, hopefully. The name Alexandria gives away the first clue. It is tied to Alexander the Great. His conquests reshaped the map. They also reshaped culture. Greek-speaking elites spread across huge areas and carried books, habits, and pride with them. Then Alexander died, and his empire did what big empires often do. It broke apart. Egypt became one of the major pieces, and it ended up ruled by a Greek-speaking dynasty, the Ptolemies. This is where the why then begins. The Ptolemies had a gift and a problem at the same time. The gift was Egypt itself. Egypt was rich, mainly because of the Nile. Grain production was massive, and grain was power. If you can feed people, you can influence politics far beyond your own borders. The problem was legitimacy. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt, but they were outsiders at the start. They had to prove they belonged. They had to look stable, strong, and worthy, like the natural rulers of this very old land. So they built projects that made that claim feel real. And one of the strongest projects the ruler can fund is culture. Culture is not just decoration. It is reputation. It is authority. It is a way to say, we are not only wealthy, we are important. At this time, the Mediterranean world was competitive. Other cities had old schools, old temples, old reputations. Other rulers also wanted to be seen as the true center of Greek learning. So Alexandria needed something that could outshine older places, something that would pull talented people in, something visitors would talk about when they went home. That something was knowledge. Not knowledge as a soft hobby, knowledge as a political project. Here is the simple truth. The library did not appear because everyone suddenly became sweet, peaceful book lovers. It appeared because knowledge had value. It could train administrators, help trade and navigation, support engineering and medicine. And yes, it could make kings look brilliant. Also, it could make a new dynasty feel legitimate. If you sponsor the best thinkers, you start to look like you deserve to rule. It is not romantic, but it is very effective. There is another important detail. A library of this scale needs resources. Not just money, but time. Time to copy scrolls. Time to teach. Time to argue over commas like your life depends on it. Most people in the ancient world did not have spare time. They had work and survival. So when a ruler offers safety, food, and quiet rooms to think, that offer is huge. This is why Alexandria was the right place. They already had ships and trade networks. They already had wealth moving through it. And it already had a government that wanted prestige. There is a popular myth right here. It says Alexandria was instantly a perfect city of knowledge, like it was born with a library in one hand and a wisdom beard in the other. But real cities don't work like that. They grow. They get crowded. They fight. They change rulers. They sometimes make dumb decisions. And they keep going anyway. So Alexandria before the library is not a quiet prologue. It is a busy stage being built. And there is one more reason the city fit the idea so well. Alexandria sat between cultures. Egypt had deep traditions of record-keeping and learning in temples. The Greek world had its own traditions, philosophy, literature, debate, and the habit of collecting texts. In Alexandria, those streams could meet. Not always smoothly, but they could meet. And when streams meet, they don't just add water. They make new currents. So when later generations talked about Alexandria as the place with the greatest library, the claim did not come from nowhere. The city was built to receive and organize goods, people, and ideas. Now let's do the gentle ledger again. What we know. Alexandria grew into a major Mediterranean port and planned city. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt's wealth, especially grain, gave rulers huge resources. The Ptolemaic court had strong reasons to sponsor culture and scholarship as prestige and power. What is myth or uncertain? That Alexandria was a perfect utopia of learning from day one. That everybody supported the project or lived in harmony around it. That the library's rise was purely romantic, with no politics involved. And now we can step closer. In the next chapter, we enter the big idea itself, the Mausan and the library as a system. Not just a building, more like an engine. When people say the Library of Alexandria, most of us picture one thing. One big building. One giant room. One perfect place where every scroll on earth is sitting politely on a shelf, like students who are scared of the teacher. But the real idea is more interesting than that. Because the library in Alexandria was not just a room full of scrolls. It was closer to a system. A living machine made of people, space, money, rules, and routine. And right at the center of that system was something called the Mouse Ion. It sounds fancy. It also sounds like a place where mice do research. Like tiny scholars in little robes, arguing about philosophy over a crumb of bread. But no, Mouse Ion means place of the muses. The muses were the divine inspiration behind art and learning. So the Mouse Ion was basically a home for study. A place that took thinking seriously. Now here's the important part. The Mouse Ion and the library are often discussed together because they were connected. But they are not the exact same thing. Think of it like this. The Mouse Ion is the community and the engine. The library is the fuel and the storage. The Mouse Ion is where scholars live, work, teach, argue, and write. The library is where texts are collected, organized, copied, and kept ready for use. In modern terms, it's not a perfect match, but it helps. The Mouse Ion is a research institute. The library is the massive research collection that supports it. And that difference matters because it changes how we understand the legend. If you imagine one building, then you imagine one disaster. One fire, one night, one ending. But if you imagine a system, multiple rooms, multiple stores, multiple hands copying text, then the story becomes more complex. Loss can happen in pieces. And survival can happen in pieces too. Let's gently step inside this system. First, the people. The Mouse Ion gathered scholars. Not just writers of poetry, but people doing many kinds of study. Text experts, math minds, astronomy watchers, people who cared deeply about the correct version of a sentence written 300 years ago. And these scholars were not doing their work as a weekend hobby. They were supported. This is a key point. There is strong reason to think scholars in Alexandria, connected to this royal project, had state backing. Food support, a place to live or work, social status, access to materials. In a world where most people worked constantly, this kind of support was like giving someone a quiet room inside a storm. And once you have a stable group of scholars, you need a stable flow of texts. So now we move to the work behind the scenes, acquisition and copying. If you want a huge library, you have to collect. That means buying scrolls, asking for copies, trading, convincing, sometimes being a bit aggressive. And I don't mean aggressive like a superhero movie. I mean aggressive like a person on online shopping day who says, if I don't click now, it's gone forever. Ancient rulers wanted prestige. Scholars wanted access. And scrolls were not infinite. Every scroll was a physical thing. It had to be produced. It had to be stored safely. It had to be copied carefully by hand. So the system needed scribes. Scribes were the quiet heroes of the story. They did not just copy. They had to read, write, correct, and sometimes guess what a damaged line was supposed to be. They made mistakes too, because they were human. But the whole engine depended on them. Picture a long room, warm with oil lamps. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Hands moving, ink drying, scrolls being rolled and unrolled. A calm rhythm, like someone knitting. This is how a library becomes huge, not by magic, by labor. Now think about storage. Scrolls do not like humidity. They do not like fire. They do not like bugs. They do not like being dropped. They basically don't like anything fun. So storing scrolls was a serious job. You need controlled spaces. You need organization. And you need people who know what goes where. Which brings us to one of the most important ideas in the whole story. A library is not just collecting. It is organizing. If you gather 200,000 scrolls and pile them in a corner, you do not have a great library. You have a disaster waiting to happen. A working library needs systems, categories, lists, labels, and memory. It needs a way to answer the question, where is the thing I need? This is why the Library of Alexandria becomes so famous. Not only because it collected, but because it tried to arrange knowledge in a usable way. It's also why the Mouse Ion matters. Because scholars don't just want books. They want access. They want to find a text, compare copies, correct errors, and write comments on it. That is what scholarship looks like in this era. A lot of it is not new invention. It is careful cleaning, sorting, comparing, and preserving. It's like restoring an old painting. Not flashy, but if you don't do it, the image fades. So if we speak very simply, the system worked like this. A ruler funds the project because it increases prestige and power. Scholars gather because support and access are offered. Texts are collected through trade, copying, and networks. Scribes copy and preserve. Organizers catalog and sort. Scholars use the text, create new versions, write commentaries, teach others, and add new work back into the world. That loop is the secret. It's not one building. It's a feedback cycle. And here is something calming to notice. A system like that is strong in one way and fragile in another. It's strong because it's not just one scroll. It is many copies, many hands, many paths. But it's fragile because it depends on support. It depends on stability. It depends on people agreeing that this matters. If the funding weakens, fewer scrolls are bought. If politics turns, scholars can be pushed out. If war hits the city, storage spaces can be damaged. If priorities shift, the whole machine slows down. So when we later talk about the destruction of the library, keep this image in your mind. Not a single chest of treasure. A living engine. And engines don't always stop with one big explosion. Sometimes they stop because the fuel runs out little by little. Okay? Let's do the gentle ledger. What we know. Alexandria had a major scholarly institution often linked to the Mouseion, supported by royal power. The library functioned as more than shelves. It needed acquisition, copying, organization, and staff. Scholarship there depended on access to texts and systems for managing large collections. What is myth or uncertain? That the Mouseion was exactly like a modern university with clear departments and a known daily schedule. That everything was in one single main building with one perfect layout we can describe confidently. That every part of the system is documented in detail, like we have the blueprint and employee handbook. To build a legend, you need a beginning. And the Library of Alexandria has a beginning people love to keep neat and clean. A founder, a date, a ribbon-cutting moment, a king smiling while scholars clap politely. Real life rarely gives us that. What we have instead is a slow, royal project that likely grew in stages. The kind of project that starts as an idea, then becomes a habit, then becomes a machine, and finally becomes a symbol. So who started it? Many stories point to the early Ptolemaic kings, especially Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II. They ruled Egypt after Alexander's empire broke apart. They had money, ambition, and something to prove. That something to prove matters. Because the library was not only about curiosity, it was also about power. If you can gather the best minds, you can gather prestige. If you can gather the best books, you can claim you are the true center of culture. And in the ancient world, culture was not just art. It was legitimacy. It told the world, we are not temporary rulers. We are the real deal. So the Ptolemies invested in big things. Buildings, temples, ports, and yes, scholarship. Now, there is also a figure who often appears in the background of the founding story, Demetrius of Phalerum, a politician and intellectual who ended up in Egypt after losing power in Athens. Some traditions claim he advised the early Ptolemies and helped shape the library project. Is that true? Maybe partly. But the safe approach is this. Even if one smart advisor helped, a project this big still needs royal funding, staff, and years of work. It cannot be one genius idea alone. So instead of a single founder, imagine a founding mood. A mood made of competition and confidence. Because Alexandria did not build a library in a vacuum. It built it in a world where other cities already had reputations. Athens had philosophy. Rhodes had scholars. Pergamon would later become famous for its own library. There were cultural rivalries everywhere. And rivalry does something funny. It makes people overspend. You know this feeling if you have ever bought something just because your friend said, "Mine is better." Now imagine that feeling, but with kings. So the plan was likely something like this. Collect texts on a massive scale. Bring scholars to Alexandria. Support them so they can work full-time. Create a center of learning that makes the dynasty look brilliant. There's also a deeper idea hiding inside that plan. If you collect text, you also control texts. You decide which copy is official. You decide which version gets copied most. You decide who gets access. That is not evil by default, but it is real. And it helps explain why rulers cared so much. Now, let's talk about the dream that people love most. The dream of collecting everything. You will hear claims like, they wanted every book in the world. They tried to gather all knowledge. That sounds dramatic. It is also the kind of claim people make when they are excited, not when they are writing careful reports. But here is a calmer way to say it. They wanted to gather as much as possible, especially the texts that mattered in Greek culture, and also texts from other cultures when they could get them. So yes, the ambition was huge. But everything in the world is a very big suitcase. Even kings have limits. There is another important part of the founding plan, organization. Collecting is only half the battle. If you have thousands of scrolls, you need a way to find them. So even early on, the library project likely involved storage rules, categories, and staff who handled copying and sorting. This is where the story becomes less like a fairy tale and more like a workplace. And honestly, that makes it more believable. Because if you remove the magic, you see the real miracle. A lot of humans doing boring, careful work, day after day, keeping text alive. Now, one more thing before we close this chapter. When people say the library was founded, they often imagine a single building suddenly appearing. But it may be better to imagine a growing royal complex. Rooms, archives, study spaces, collections that expand, catalogs that get updated, a living system that changes with each generation. That also explains something else. If the library grew over time, then its end would likely be messy too. Not a clean final page. More like a book that slowly loses chapters. Okay? Gentle ledger time. What we know. The early Ptolemies strongly supported scholarship and cultural projects in Alexandria. The library tradition is linked to royal power and royal funding. The library likely grew over time, not in one single instant. What is myth or uncertain? A single founding day with a perfect origin story. Exactly how much one advisor or one person shaped the project. That the plan was literally every book in the world, in a strict and practical sense. Next chapter, we follow the scrolls. How do you actually get that many texts into one city? You shop, you trade, you copy, and sometimes you get a little greedy. If you want a giant library, you need one thing more than wisdom. You need supply. Scrolls do not appear because someone wants knowledge. They appear because someone pays for materials, pays for labor, and waits patiently while ink dries. So the Library of Alexandria, this huge idea, had a very practical side. It had to hunt for texts, and the hunt likely worked in a few ways. First, buying. There were book markets in the ancient world. Texts could be sold, traded, and copied. Collectors existed. Private libraries existed. And in a busy port city like Alexandria, goods came in from many places. Second, requesting copies. If you can't buy the original, you can commission a copy. That sounds simple, but it takes time. Scribes must copy by hand, and copying by hand means mistakes happen. So you want skilled scribes, and skilled scribes cost money. Third, borrowing. Borrowing is a polite word. Sometimes borrowing includes pressure. Sometimes borrowing becomes we'll give it back after we copy it, which is still polite, but also a slightly threatening if you're the one lending it. And now we reach the famous harbor story. The story goes like this. Ships arrive in Alexandria. Officials search them for books. Scrolls are taken, copied, and the copies are returned, while the originals are kept. It is a great story. It feels like the library is a hungry creature at the harbor, sniffing out knowledge like bread. Is it true? This is where we use our calm voice. It might be partly true. It might reflect a real attitude, aggressive collecting. But we should not treat it like a documented daily policy, like Step 1, dock ship. Step 2, lose your books. Because the details come through sources that can be messy, late, or shaped by storytelling. Still, even if the exact harbor routine is exaggerated, the big picture is likely correct. Alexandria collected aggressively. And that makes sense, because knowledge was status, and status is a competitive sport. Also, the Ptolemies had the tools to do this. They controlled a powerful port. They controlled wealth. They could buy rare texts. They could offer rewards. They could fund copying projects at scale. Now, let's imagine the quieter side of this hunt. Not the officials at the docks. The scribes. A scroll arrives. It is unrolled carefully. A scribe reads a line, then writes it. Reads, writes. Slow, steady. Sometimes two scribes work together. One reads aloud, one writes. Sometimes the scribe pauses, frowns, and wonders if a word is smudged. Sometimes a line is damaged, and the scribe guesses. This is how texts travel through time. Not as perfect objects, but as living chains of copying. And this is why the library is not just a pile of originals. It is also a factory of copies, which means the library can both preserve and change texts at the same time. That sounds scary, but it is also normal. If you have ever copied notes from someone and later realized you wrote cat instead of cut, you understand ancient history more than you think. Now, where did all these scrolls go? We have to be careful again. We don't have a full blueprint of storage rooms, but we can picture something realistic. Organized spaces, shelves, or pigeonhole-like storage, tags or identifiers, staff who knew the system. And because scrolls are fragile, storage mattered. Dry conditions mattered. Safety mattered. And here's a sleepy little irony. The library hunted scrolls like treasures, but scrolls hate danger. They hate fire. They hate water. They hate time. So the more scrolls you collect, the more fragile your treasure becomes. It's like owning 10,000 glass cups. Impressive, yes. Also terrifying. Now, a final note on the hunt. The library did not just gather famous poetry. It also gathered technical works, histories, local records, and scholarship. And it likely gathered multiple copies of important texts, because comparing copies helps scholars decide what the best reading is. That is one of the hidden powers of a big collection. It allows comparison, which means the library was not only storing knowledge, it was actively shaping the standard versions of texts. Okay? Ledger time. What we know. Large-scale collecting and copying were essential to ancient libraries, and Alexandria is famous for doing this aggressively. Copying was labor-heavy and required skilled scribes and organization. Big collections enable comparison, editing, and standardization of texts. What is myth or uncertain? The exact details of the seize every ship's books policy as a routine practice. How many texts came through the harbor versus markets, gifts, or commission copies? The precise physical layout of storage, down to the last shelf. Next chapter, we meet the library's quiet superpower, cataloging. Because if you can't find anything, you don't really have a library. You have a scroll jungle. Let's be honest. A giant library without a catalog is not a library. It is a panic attack. Imagine walking into a room with tens of thousands of scrolls and someone says, "Sure, Homer is in there somewhere." Somewhere. That word would ruin your whole day. So the Library of Alexandria needed something that sounds boring but is actually heroic. Organization. The kind of organization that makes the difference between knowledge and chaos. And this is where one name often enters the story, Callimachus. Callimachus was a scholar and poet connected with Alexandria, and he is famously associated with creating a massive cataloging project called the Pinox, often described as lists or tables that organize the library's holdings. Now, we have to be careful. We don't have the Pinox sitting on our desk today. It does not survive in full. But later references suggest it existed and was important. And even if the details blur, the idea is solid. If Alexandria had a huge collection, it needed a way to map it. So what does a catalog mean in this world? Not barcodes, not search engines, not typing Homer PDF into a box and praying. It means lists, categories, names of authors, titles of works, notes about content, maybe notes about where the scroll is stored. In other words, metadata. It is the ancient version of asking, where did I save that file? Except if you lose it, you can't just check your downloads folder. You have to walk into a room and guess. So cataloging was the calm brain of the whole system. It allowed scholars to do work that seems invisible but changes everything. Finding the right text, comparing versions, and building reliable editions. And this is where the library becomes not just big, but powerful. Because it can answer questions like, do we have this author? Which copy is older? Where is the version with the extra line? Has anyone already written commentary on this? Without a catalog, scholarship slows down. With a catalog, scholarship becomes efficient. Now, I know efficient is not a bedtime word, but think of it like this. A catalog makes the library feel calm. It turns a mountain into a map, and maps are soothing. They make you feel like you're not lost. So how might the library have organized texts? Likely by broad categories: poetry, drama, philosophy, history, medicine, mathematics, and so on. And within those categories, by author, by title, by edition, by notes. But again, we should not pretend we know the exact structure. It is tempting to imagine a perfect modern system, like the ancient librarians invented the Dewey Decimal System in sandals. It's possible their system was brilliant, but it was also shaped by their world, what they valued, what they considered important, and what they considered serious. Cataloging also brings up another quiet truth. Libraries are not neutral. When you catalog, you decide what counts as a category. You decide which authors are main and which are minor. You decide what gets copied first. Even if nobody is trying to be unfair, choices still shape the collection. So the library's catalog was not only a tool, it was also a kind of cultural mirror. It showed what Alexandria wanted to be. And that is why later generations admired it so much. They didn't just admire the size. They admired the ambition to organize the world through texts. Now picture a scholar arriving. He wants a specific work. Maybe a tragedy. Maybe a medical treatise. Maybe a rare poem. He does not wander for hours like a confused tourist. He goes to the staff or the catalog area and checks the lists. He finds the author, finds the title, and then someone retrieves the scroll. That retrieval is a small moment, but it is a miracle of system design. It is also a reminder the library was not just shelves. It was staff, process, and memory. And if the staff leaves or the process breaks, the library's power fades fast. Because without the cataloging brain, the body becomes clumsy. That's also why the one-night burn story feels too simple. A library can be damaged without flames. If the catalog is lost, if the staff is scattered, if funding dries up, the system can collapse quietly. No smoke needed. Just slow forgetting. Okay? Ledger time. What we know. A collection as large as Alexandria's would require serious organization and cataloging. Callimachus is strongly associated in tradition with a major cataloging effort, Pinox. Catalogs make scholarship possible at scale by turning collections into usable maps. What is myth or uncertain? The exact structure and full content of the Pinox, since it does not survive intact. Precise details of a library's shelving and retrieval system, like we have a floor plan. That the catalog was perfect or modern in the way people sometimes imagine. Next chapter, we slow down and step into the human side. A day inside the Mausa. Lamps, lectures, quiet rivalries, and scholars being scholars. Now that we have the city and the big system, let's do something cozy. Let's spend one slow day inside the Maison. Not like a tourist rushing around. More like someone who belongs there. Someone who walks softly, because this place is full of people thinking very hard, and nobody wants their thoughts to spill. In your mind, you step past tall columns. The stone is cool. The air is calmer than the street. You can feel that this is a place made for long attention. Somewhere nearby, a lamp is burning. Not bright like modern light, more like a warm circle. The kind of light that makes everything feel slower. Now, we need to be honest again. We don't have a perfect schedule written down like 9 a.m. Greek grammar, 10 a.m. dramatic sighing, 11 a.m. debate about commas. So when we describe a day, we are doing a careful reconstruction, a realistic one. And it starts with a simple truth. The Mazan was a community. Scholars were not just passing through. They were gathered, supported, and set apart from normal life in a way that mattered. In the ancient world, time to think was rare. Most people did not have it. So when a ruler funds a place where thinking is your job, that changes everything. So picture the morning. A scholar wakes up in Alexandria. Maybe he lives near the complex, maybe within it, maybe connected to it. He eats something simple. Bread, olives, maybe fish. Nothing fancy. Scholars are not always rich, but they are supported enough to keep going. And then he walks into the work. He might start by reading. Not reading for fun. Reading with a sharp eye. Because the kind of scholarship Alexandria becomes famous for is often about texts. Old texts. Important texts. Texts that exist in multiple copies. And multiple copies mean a problem. Which one is correct? So this scholar unrolls a scroll. He reads. He pauses. He compares it with another version. He notices a line that feels wrong. A word that doesn't fit. A phrase that sounds like it was added later. He writes a note. Not a dramatic note. Quiet note. And that note matters. Because this is how ancient literature survives. Through people who cared enough to be picky. Now, if you keep walking, you hear voices. A lesson maybe. A reading aloud. A small group discussion. And this is another key point. A place like the Mouse Ion is not only storage and writing. It is also teaching. Teaching is how knowledge becomes alive. And teaching also creates the next generation of scholars who keep copying, correcting, and debating. And yes, debating. If you think scholars are always calm and gentle, I have bad news. Scholars can be competitive. Sometimes very competitive. Not always in a loud way. Often in a quiet way, which is somehow more intense. Like this. One scholar publishes a commentary on a famous poem. Another scholar reads it and thinks, that is wrong. He does not say it loudly. He says it in writing. And he makes sure everyone important sees it. This kind of rivalry is not just ego. It is also a method. Because if you want to build strong knowledge, you need challenge. You need someone to say, prove it. So the Mouse Ion, for all its calm lamps and quiet rooms, was also full of tension. Not scary tension. More like a nerd tension. The kind where someone is politely smiling while mentally planning to destroy your argument in the next footnote. Now let's imagine lunch. In many traditions about the Mouse Ion, scholars are supported with food, maybe communal meals. This makes sense. If the state is sponsoring thinkers, it's easier to sponsor them if you feed them. And a shared meal is also social glue. It keeps the community together. Picture a long table. Simple dishes. Light conversation. People who have spent the morning wrestling with texts, now trying to act normal. One scholar says something like, I found 3 different versions of that line. Another scholar sighs like a man who has seen too much. Someone jokes, maybe Homer wrote it in a hurry. Everyone smiles, even if they don't want to. Then, the afternoon. This is the part of the day where the library system really shows its power. Scholars request texts. Staff retrieve scrolls. Scribes copy. Organizers track and catalog. It's a quiet industry. And it's easy to forget how physical it all is. A scroll is not a file. It is a thing. It can tear. It can smudge. It can crumble. So every movement is careful. Every handling is a small act of preservation. Now imagine a different kind of scholar. Not the poet commentary type. Maybe someone focused on geography, math, or astronomy. He is still in the same system. He still needs texts, but he also needs tools, measurements, observations, maybe instruments. Alexandria is a port city. It has maps. It has travelers. It has information flowing in with ships. So even without modern science, it has a kind of data stream. And scholars do what scholars do. They try to turn messy information into patterns. Now evening. The light gets softer. People go home, or to their rooms, or to the kind of quiet walk that lets the mind settle. The Mouse Ion at night is not empty, but it is slower. A few lamps still burn. A few people still read. Someone is still copying. And this is the feeling I want you to keep. The library is not only a dramatic symbol of loss. It is also a symbol of steady effort, thousands of small actions, over years, over generations. That is why the myth of one night destroyed everything feels too simple. Because this place was not a single object. It was a daily routine. And routines don't vanish like magic. They fade when support fades. They break when politics breaks. They scatter when a city becomes unsafe. Now ledger time. What we know. Alexandria supported a major scholarly community tied to royal power and resources. Scholars worked with texts in ways that shaped copying, correction, and interpretation. A big institution like this would involve staff, routines, and systems, not just lone geniuses. What is myth or uncertain? The exact daily schedule and living arrangements in detail. How communal meals worked, how many scholars lived on site, and what the rules were. The full social reality, because later writers often romanticize or exaggerate. Next chapter, we zoom in on the results. What did this machine produce? What changed because people sat under lamps and argued about lines of text? If Alexandria had only collected scrolls and stared at them lovingly, it would still be impressive. But the reason it becomes legendary is because work happened there. Work that shaped how knowledge was preserved, cleaned, and passed on. Now, we have to be careful with famous names. People like to attach every genius to Alexandria like it's a magnet. Sometimes that connection is strong. Sometimes it's more like, he lived in the same century, so probably. So tonight we'll do the calm version. We talk about what Alexandria is strongly associated with, and we avoid claiming more than we can support. Let's start with a quiet superpower, editing. In the ancient world, texts were copied by hand. That means mistakes spread. And over time, a famous work could exist in many versions, each a little different. So scholars in Alexandria worked on something that sounds boring but is actually huge. They try to make reliable texts. Think about Homer, for example. Homer was central to Greek culture. People studied him like a foundation stone. But if every copy is slightly different, then what exactly are you studying? So Alexandrian scholarship becomes famous for textual criticism, comparing copies, choosing readings, marking doubtful lines, writing commentary, creating editions that later generations treat as more standard. This kind of work changes culture quietly. Because once a standard version spreads, it becomes the version most people inherit. And this is where humor sneaks in. Imagine being a scholar whose life's work is deciding whether one word should be an or but. It's easy to joke about. But that tiny choice can change meaning. So yes, this work is small in shape, but big in effect. Now let's shift to math. Alexandria becomes linked in tradition with major mathematical work. Euclid is the most famous example people mention, often tied to Alexandria as a center of learning. Even if we avoid overclaiming the exact building he sat in, the broader truth still stands. Hellenistic Alexandria was a place where mathematics was valued and supported. And mathematics has a special bedtime quality. It's calm. It's orderly. It's a world where things behave. A triangle does not wake up one day and decide to be dramatic. It just stays a triangle. Now geography. Alexandria sits by the sea, and trade routes bring information. Sailors talk. Merchants measure distances. Officials track resources. In that environment, geography becomes more than a map on a wall. It becomes a tool. And this is where Alexandria is associated with figures like Eratosthenes, famous for estimating Earth's circumference using observations and reasoning. The details of ancient measurement stories can be debated, but the key idea is important. This era produced serious attempts to measure the world with logic. That matters because it shows the library world wasn't only about old poems. It was also about understanding nature, space, and scale. Now medicine. The Hellenistic period is linked with advances in anatomical and medical study in certain places, and Alexandria is often mentioned in that context. But we must be careful here, because later stories can get dramatic and details can be debated. So here is the safe, calm takeaway. Alexandria was part of a broader world where medical knowledge was studied, written, organized, and transmitted, and large scholarly centers helped store and spread that knowledge. Even when we don't know every detail, we can see the effect. Medical texts, theories, and practices moved through time partly because they were written down and copied. Now here is the main point of this chapter. The library's greatest invention may not be one discovery. It may be the habit of building knowledge on top of knowledge. Because once you have a massive collection and a community of experts, you get a special kind of progress. You get layering. One scholar writes a commentary on a poem. Another scholar writes a commentary on that commentary. Someone corrects an older text. Someone measures something and records it. Someone argues against it and records that too. And over time, this creates a thick web of thought. It's like a city built not from one building, but from generations adding rooms. Now, a gentle warning. Because Alexandria becomes a symbol, people love to say, it contained all knowledge. It was centuries ahead of its time. It had secrets we lost forever. Some of that is just emotion talking. And emotion is fine, but it can slide into fantasy. The truth is still amazing without magic. The truth is that Alexandria helped shape methods. Collecting, comparing, cataloging, editing, teaching, transmitting. Methods survive even when buildings don't. And that might be the quiet comfort hidden inside this story. Even if scrolls were lost, the idea of organized scholarship spread. Other centers learned from it. Other libraries formed. Other scholars copied. So when you hear the library described as the greatest, you can translate that into something calmer. It was one of the most influential knowledge systems of its world. That's already huge. Now ledger time. What we know. Alexandria is strongly associated with major advances in textual scholarship, editing, commentary, and comparison of manuscripts. It functioned as a center where math, geography, and many fields were studied and transmitted. The institution's power was not only discoveries, but the method of building and organizing knowledge. What is myth or uncertain? That every famous ancient thinker worked there directly, in the same place at the same time. That the library held all knowledge or secret tech far beyond its era. Exact details of certain famous anecdotes, which can be shaped by later storytelling. Next chapter, we enter one of the most famous story zones of Alexandria, translation. A beautiful legend, a complicated reality, and a question that keeps coming back. What happened when many languages met under one sky? If Alexandria had only collected scrolls and stared at them lovingly, it would still be impressive. But the reason it becomes legendary is because work happened there. Work that shaped how knowledge was preserved, cleaned, and passed on. Now, we have to be careful with famous names. People like to attach every genius to Alexandria like it's a magnet. Sometimes that connection is strong. Sometimes it's more like, he lived in the same century, so probably. So tonight we'll do the calm version. We talk about what Alexandria is strongly associated with, and we avoid claiming more than we can support. Let's start with the quiet superpower, editing. In the ancient world, texts were copied by hand. That means mistakes spread. And over time, a famous work could exist in many versions, each a little different. So scholars in Alexandria worked on something that sounds boring but is actually huge. They try to make reliable texts. Think about Homer, for example. Homer was central to Greek culture. People studied him like a foundation stone. But if every copy is slightly different, then what exactly are you studying? So Alexandrian scholarship becomes famous for textual criticism, comparing copies, choosing readings, marking doubtful lines, writing commentary, creating editions that later generations treat as more standard. This kind of work changes culture quietly. Because once a standard version spreads, it becomes the version most people inherit. And this is where humor sneaks in. Imagine being a scholar whose life's work is deciding whether one word should be an or but. It's easy to joke about. But that tiny choice can change meaning. So yes, this work is small in shape, but big in effect. Now let's shift to math. Alexandria becomes linked in tradition with major mathematical work. Euclid is the most famous example people mention, often tied to Alexandria as a center of learning. Even if we avoid overclaiming the exact building he sat in, the broader truth still stands. Hellenistic Alexandria was a place where mathematics was valued and supported. And mathematics has a special bedtime quality. It's calm. It's orderly. It's a world where things behave. A triangle does not wake up one day and decide to be dramatic. It just stays a triangle. Now geography. Alexandria sits by the sea, and trade routes bring information. Sailors talk. Merchants measure distances. Officials track resources. In that environment, geography becomes more than a map on a wall. It becomes a tool. And this is where Alexandria is associated with figures like Eratosthenes, famous for estimating Earth's circumference using observations and reasoning. The details of ancient measurement stories can be debated, but the key idea is important. This era produced serious attempts to measure the world with logic. That matters because it shows the library world wasn't only about old poems. It was also about understanding nature, space, and scale. Now medicine. The Hellenistic period is linked with advances in anatomical and medical study in certain places, and Alexandria is often mentioned in that context. But we must be careful here, because later stories can get dramatic and details can be debated. So here is the safe, calm takeaway. Alexandria was part of a broader world where medical knowledge was studied, written, organized, and transmitted, and large scholarly centers helped store and spread that knowledge. Even when we don't know every detail, we can see the effect. Medical texts, theories, and practices moved through time partly because they were written down and copied. Now here is the main point of this chapter. The library's greatest invention may not be one discovery. It may be the habit of building knowledge on top of knowledge. Because once you have a massive collection and a community of experts, you get a special kind of progress. You get layering. One scholar writes a commentary on a poem. Another scholar writes a commentary on that commentary. Someone corrects an older text. Someone measures something and records it. Someone argues against it and records that too. And over time, this creates a thick web of thought. It's like a city built not from one building, but from generations adding rooms. Now, a gentle warning. Because Alexandria becomes a symbol, people love to say, it contained all knowledge. It was centuries ahead of its time. It had secrets we lost forever. Some of that is just emotion talking. And emotion is fine, but it can slide into fantasy. The truth is still amazing without magic. The truth is that Alexandria helped shape methods. Collecting, comparing, cataloging, editing, teaching, transmitting. Methods survive even when buildings don't. And that might be the quiet comfort hidden inside this story. Even if scrolls were lost, the idea of organized scholarship spread. Other centers learned from it. Other libraries formed. Other scholars copied. So when you hear the library described as the greatest, you can translate that into something calmer. It was one of the most influential knowledge systems of its world. That's already huge. Now ledger time. What we know. Alexandria is strongly associated with major advances in textual scholarship, editing, commentary, and comparison of manuscripts. It functioned as a center where math, geography, and many fields were studied and transmitted. The institution's power was not only discoveries, but the method of building and organizing knowledge. What is myth or uncertain? That every famous ancient thinker worked there directly, in the same place at the same time. That the library held all knowledge or secret tech far beyond its era. Exact details of certain famous anecdotes, which can be shaped by later storytelling. Next chapter, we enter one of the most famous story zones of Alexandria, translation. A beautiful legend, a complicated reality, and a question that keeps coming back. What happened when many languages met under one sky? At some point in every Library of Alexandria conversation, someone asks the same question. Okay, but how many books did it have? It's a fair question. It is also the question that causes the most trouble. Because the moment numbers show up, the myth brain wakes up and gets excited. Numbers feel solid. Numbers feel like facts you can hold in your hand. But with the Library of Alexandria, numbers are slippery. First, a small but important problem. They did not have books the way we do. They had scrolls. And a scroll is not the same thing as a book. One long work could take multiple scrolls. One short work could fit on one scroll. One author might have 20 works. Or one work might be copied 10 times. So when an ancient source says X scrolls, we have to ask, do they mean titles? Do they mean physical scroll objects? Do they mean rolls of papyrus stored in jars? Do they mean copies? Do they mean summaries? It's like asking, how many files are on your computer? Do we count every photo, every duplicate, every screenshot of a meme you forgot to delete? Exactly. Now you'll often hear big numbers attached to Alexandria. Hundreds of thousands, sometimes even more. Could it have been massive for its time? Yes. But can we confidently say the exact number? Not really. And that's not because historians are hiding the truth. It's because the evidence doesn't give us a clean answer. Ancient writers sometimes use big numbers in a dramatic way. Not always to lie, but to express greatness. It's like when someone says, I waited 1,000,000 years for the bus. We all understand they mean a long time, not literally 1,000,000 years. So when someone says the library had an unbelievably huge number of scrolls, we have to consider, is this a careful inventory? Or is this a way to say it was enormous? Also, we should remember that libraries change over time. The library was not frozen in one moment. It grew. It shifted. It may have had good years and bad years. It may have had expansions and losses, then expansions again. So even if we had one solid number from one moment, it would still not describe the whole story. Now let's talk about what size really means. Because size is not just counting scrolls. Size also means how many categories of knowledge were collected, how wide the acquisition network was, how strong the cataloging system was, how many scholars and scribes were active, how much copying and editing was happening. A library with fewer scrolls but excellent organization can be more powerful than a library with more scrolls and no order. So when people ask, how big was it? Sometimes what they really mean is, how important was it? And on that question, Alexandria has a strong case. It was one of the most ambitious knowledge projects of the ancient world. It influenced scholarship. It shaped the way texts were edited and transmitted. It became a symbol for a reason. But okay, let's still address the number question in a gentle way. We can say this. Ancient traditions suggest very large holdings, possibly in the hundreds of thousands of scrolls, depending on what is being counted. But the exact figure is uncertain, and different sources give different numbers. That's the calm answer. Now let's address the biggest myth inside the numbers. The myth is, the library contained all knowledge on Earth. That sounds cool. It also sounds like something a proud city would say about itself. But all knowledge is impossible to define. Even today, no library contains everything. And today we have printers, digital storage, and delivery trucks. In the ancient world, every text had to be copied by hand, by humans, with limited time, with expensive materials. So the library could be massive without being total. And here is another quiet truth. A lot of ancient knowledge was never written down at all. Some knowledge lived in practice. Craft skills, local traditions, oral stories, private training, sacred knowledge held in specific places. So even a perfect library would still not contain the whole world. Now, another myth problem. Sometimes people say, it had all the great classical works, and then they burned, and everything vanished. But we know that many classical works survived in other places. We know copying happened across the wider Mediterranean world. We know text traveled. So even if Alexandria lost text, it could not be the single container of all copies of everything. That's not how text survival usually works. Which brings us to a calmer way to think about it. Alexandria was a major center, but it was part of a larger network. A network can lose a node and still keep some data alive elsewhere. And that's why one fire destroyed everything is such a strong myth. It gives a simple villain and a simple ending. But history is not always that tidy. Now, why does the number myth stay popular? Because people love the feeling of a giant treasure chest. We want a single place to point to, a single moment to mourn. It makes the story clean. And humans love clean stories. We don't love spreadsheets. Even though, yes, the library basically ran on ancient spreadsheets. Okay? Ledger time. What we know. The Library of Alexandria was very large and influential for its era. Ancient sources suggest huge holdings, but the numbers vary and are hard to interpret. Scroll count is tricky because one work could be multiple scrolls, and copies complicate counting. What is myth or uncertain? Any exact confident number presented as if it came from a perfect inventory. That the library literally held all knowledge on Earth. That everything important existed only there, with no copies anywhere else. Next chapter, we enter the first big fire story everyone knows, Julius Caesar and the burning harbor. And we will keep our calm voice, even while the world is on fire. When people imagine the Library of Alexandria burning, they often imagine one scene. Night. Yes. Flames climbing up shelves. Scrolls turning to ash like snow in reverse. And then they attach one name to it. Julius Caesar. This is the version many people carry around. Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria, and that was the end. It is dramatic. It is simple. And it is very likely incomplete. Here's what we can say with more confidence. There was a major conflict in Alexandria in 48 BCE during Caesar's civil war period. There was fire. The fire spread, and it likely destroyed store materials near the harbor. So yes, fire happened. Yes, books or scrolls may have been lost. But the big question is, how much was lost, and what exactly burned? Because the library could mean different things. It could mean the main collection associated with the royal quarter. It could mean storage spaces. It could mean warehouses where scrolls were kept for trade or transport. It could mean a part of the collection, not the whole system. So when a source says, books burned, we have to slow down and ask, which books? Where were they? And how connected were they to the main scholarly system? This is where the story gets less clean. Imagine Alexandria as a working port. Ports have warehouses. Warehouses have goods. Scrolls were goods too. Text copying and trade existed. So it is very plausible that large quantities of scrolls were stored in places vulnerable to a harbor fire. And during conflict, fire does not behave politely. It moves where it wants. So it is believable that a lot of scrolls burned near the docks. Does that automatically mean the main library was wiped out? Not automatically. It might have been damaged. It might have lost a chunk of texts. But the entire library claim is much harder to lock down. And here is the sleepy truth of institutions. Even if a place survives, it can still be hurt. Losing thousands of scrolls is still a disaster, even if it's not everything. Also, we should remember the library is a system. A system can lose part of its storage and still keep going, especially if it has other copies, other rooms, other sites, other staff. That does not make the loss small. It just makes the story less final. Now, let's talk about why the Caesar story became so popular. Because it has everything a perfect tragedy wants. A famous hero-villain figure. A big city in turmoil. A simple cause. A single moment of irreversible loss. It's like a movie. And humans love movie-shaped history. But the historical world is not always a movie. Sometimes it's a series, with many seasons. And the writers keep changing. So instead of asking, did Caesar burn the library? Like it's a yes or no quiz, ask a calmer question. What evidence suggests scrolls were lost in Caesar's fire? And what evidence suggests the library system continued afterward? Because continuation is a clue. If the library is mentioned later, if scholarship continues, if collections are still discussed, then the system was not fully erased in 48 BC. That does not mean there is no damage. It means the damage was not a clean ending. Also, it is worth noticing something human. People in later centuries love to blame major losses on major people. It's satisfying. If you can pin the disaster on Caesar, you don't have to deal with complicated decline, slow neglect, or messy politics. You get one dramatic villain and you can close the book. But this series is not about closing the book fast. It's about reading carefully. Now picture the fire again, but keep it realistic. Maybe it starts among ships. Maybe it spreads to stored goods. Maybe it consumes warehouses. Maybe some scroll collections burn. And while that happens, the city is loud and frightened. But the library, if it is not directly in that zone, might not be swallowed whole. Parts of it might survive. People might salvage. Copying might resume later. The system might limp forward. That is a more human kind of survival. Not a superhero rescue. Just persistence. Now ledger time. What we know. There was conflict in Alexandria around 48 BCE involving Caesar, and fire occurred. Ancient accounts connect this fire to the destruction of many scrolls or books, likely near the harbor area. It is plausible that significant textual losses happened, even if the full extent is debated. What is myth or uncertain? That Caesar burned the entire Library of Alexandria in one night, ending it forever. The exact location and identity of the burned collections, main library versus warehouses versus other storage, the precise number of scrolls lost, presented as a confident, exact figure. Next chapter, we break a big mental habit. We stop imagining one single library, and we start imagining a city with multiple collections, because that shift changes everything. Let's do a small mental exercise. Say the phrase, the Library of Alexandria. Now notice what your brain does. It probably draws one building, one location, one dramatic target. That's normal. But Alexandria was a big city, and big cities rarely keep all their important things in one single room. They spread out. They make backups. Not because they are modern geniuses, but because space is limited and needs grow. So it is very possible that Alexandria had multiple collections, multiple storage points, and multiple library-like spaces. This idea is sometimes described as a main library and a daughter library, and one place often mentioned in this context is the Serapeum. The Serapeum was a major temple complex dedicated to Serapis. It was an important religious and cultural site in Alexandria. Later traditions connect it with book collections. And whether we call it a daughter library or simply a major collection, the important point is this. Books and learning were not limited to one single room in one single district. This helps us in a very practical way, because it explains how the library story can survive multiple disasters. If Caesar's fire destroyed scrolls near the harbor, that could be one kind of loss. If later conflicts damaged the royal quarter, that could be another kind of loss. If later religious and political conflict destroyed temple complexes, that could be another kind of loss. And over time, different stories can blend together. People hear books burn in one era. They hear Serapeum destroyed in another era. They hear Alexandria changed hands in another era. And the human brain goes, oh, it must be the one big library burned once. It's a shortcut. But it makes the story less accurate. So let's slow it down. A citywide network model makes more sense. A core scholarly institution tied to royal support and scholars. Additional collections in other major complexes. Storage in warehouses or transit points. Private collections and smaller learning spaces. Copying operations and workshops that keep text moving. When you imagine this network, the library becomes less like a treasure chest and more like a nervous system. And nervous systems don't die in one moment unless something extremely final happens. They weaken. They lose connections. They become less coordinated. Now, what about the Serapeum specifically? We should be careful because the Serapeum has heavy history attached to it, and later writers can be emotional or polemical. What we can say gently is, the Serapeum was significant, and later sources associate it with learning and possibly book collections. But the exact size of those collections and whether they represented the remaining library is uncertain. This is important because many people imagine the Serapeum as the last safe box holding everything that survived Caesar. That is a very clean story, and it might be too clean. It's possible the Serapeum held important texts. It's also possible that by the late Roman period, the great centralized collection had already changed, shrunk, moved, or fragmented. A library system is a living thing. It does not stay the same for centuries. So the daughter library idea is useful as a concept, but we should not treat it like a perfectly documented organizational chart. Now here is the sleepy comfort hidden inside this chapter. If Alexandria had multiple collections, then loss is tragic, but survival is also more likely. Because if one place burns, another place might still hold a copy. If one building is destroyed, another building might still store texts. If one era is violent, another era might rebuild part of the system. That doesn't mean everything survives. It means the story is not one single cliff. It is a long slope. And that slope is why the myth stays strong. People want a cliff. A cliff gives you a clean lesson. But slopes are real life. Slopes are how most things disappear. Slow, uneven, and hard to notice. So when someone says, the Library of Alexandria burned, you can now ask a calmer follow-up. Which part? Which time? Which building? Which collection? Not to be annoying, just to be accurate. Okay? Ledger time. What we know. Alexandria was a large city where major collections could exist in more than one place. The Serapeum was a major complex, and later traditions connect it to learning and possibly book collections. Thinking of the library as a network helps explain why the story involves multiple losses over time. What is myth or uncertain? A neat, fully proven main library versus daughter library structure with exact roles and inventories. That the Serapeum definitely held the whole remaining library at a specific moment. That we can map every collection site in Alexandria with modern confidence. Next chapter, we move into something less dramatic than fire, but sometimes more deadly. Slow unraveling. Funding, politics, and the fragile truth that institutions can fade without flames. If you only know the Library of Alexandria as a tragedy with flames, this chapter might feel almost too quiet. Because sometimes the thing that kills a great institution is not fire. It's paperwork. It's budgets. It's politics. It's the slow moment when someone powerful looks at the library and says, "Not right now." And the scary part is how normal that is. A library like Alexandria's did not run on vibes. It ran on support. It needed money for papyrus, money for ink, money for scribes, money for staff who organized and retrieved texts, money to feed scholars, house them, keep them working. In other words, it needed a sponsor who cared. And for a while it had one. But dynasties change. Rulers change. Priorities change. One king might love scholarship. The next might love war. Or monuments. Or parties. Or just staying alive, which is also understandable. So even without any dramatic destruction, the library system could weaken. Imagine a simple chain. If funding shrinks, fewer texts are bought. If fewer texts are bought, the collection stops growing. If the collection stops growing, the library becomes less exciting. If it becomes less exciting, top scholars go elsewhere. If top scholars leave, the institution loses energy. If the institution loses energy, fewer students come. And then you don't get a dramatic ending. You get a slow fade. And that fade can take generations. Now, here is something important. Alexandria was not a peaceful bubble floating above history. It was a city inside history. It dealt with power struggles, court politics, social tension, and sometimes violence. When the city becomes unstable, scholars don't always stay. Also, scholarship is not only about intelligence. It is about safety. It's hard to write careful commentary on poetry when you're worried about riots. It's hard to copy a fragile text when the city feels like it could explode. So the Mausoleum and the library system were vulnerable to instability. And we need to remember the library was not one thing. It was a network of people and routines. People can leave. Routines can break, even if the building stands. Now, another quiet danger, politics inside scholarship. If the library is tied to royal power, it can become a political tool. That can bring resources, but it can also bring risk. If scholars depend on the court, then court drama can become scholarly drama. One scholar might be favored. Another might be ignored. A new ruler might want new voices, or might distrust certain schools of thought. Sometimes intellectual life suffers not because knowledge is hated, but because knowledge is connected to influence. And influence makes people nervous. So the library could be affected by things like purges, exile, rivalry, shifting patronage, changes in cultural policy. And again, none of that requires flames. It's the slow kind of destruction, the kind you only notice later. There's also the issue of maintenance. Scrolls are fragile. Papyrus can decay. Ink can fade. Storage needs care. If staff shrinks, preservation shrinks. If preservation shrinks, texts quietly die. Not in a dramatic place, more like a candle going out while nobody is watching. And this is why the myth of one fire destroyed everything is so tempting. It saves us from the uncomfortable truth that real decline can be boring. But boring decline is real decline. And the Library of Alexandria might have faced exactly that. Long periods where the system was less supported, less organized, less alive. Now, I'm not saying nothing dramatic ever happened. Dramatic events did happen, and we will get to them. But even dramatic events hit harder when the institution is already weakened. If you have a strong system, you can recover from damage. If you have a weak system, even small damage can become fatal. So think of this chapter as the slow background music of the story, the quiet part that makes later the disasters worse. Also, small joke because bedtime needs a smile. When people imagine ancient libraries, they imagine philosophers and candles. But behind every philosopher is a guy who is basically doing ancient admin work like, who borrowed this scroll, and why is it sticky? That guy matters. If the admin people disappear, the whole place falls apart. Now ledger time. What we know. Large scholarly institutions depended on ongoing patronage, stability, and staff. Alexandria went through political and social changes that could affect its institutions. Libraries can decline without a single catastrophic event, through reduced support and fractured routines. What is myth or uncertain? A single clean decline date when the library suddenly became weak. That every change was purely anti-intellectual, often it's just shifting priorities. That we can track the library's funding and staffing year by year like a modern budget report. Next chapter, we move into the kind of chaos that cities fear. Major wars and urban damage. Not a legend. Just history being heavy. Now we step into a later era, when the Roman world starts to shake. Not a small shake. A big one. The 3rd century is often described as a time of crisis in the Roman Empire. Pressure at borders, internal conflict, fast-changing leadership, economic strain. In times like that, cities don't just lose money. They lose calm. And Alexandria, being important, was not protected from this. If your city matters, history visits you more often. Sometimes in a nice way. Sometimes with swords. Now, one name often connected to major damage in Alexandria is Aurelian. Again, we keep the calm voice. We don't always have perfect detail on exactly what happened to every building. But we do have strong reason to believe Alexandria experienced serious conflict and damage in later Roman periods. And that matters because of a key idea. The earliest library project was tied to the royal quarter, the central elite zones, the places that politics and war tend to hit. So even if the library was not one building, the core of the system could be located in vulnerable areas. Urban warfare is especially destructive because it doesn't stay in neat battlefields. It breaks streets. It breaks supply lines. It breaks storage. It breaks people. And even if a building survives, the staff might not. A library is not just architecture. It is organization. If you destroy the spaces, you lose the scrolls. If you scatter the staff, you lose the system. If you disrupt copying networks, you lose the future. So this period is often treated as one likely contributor to the library's long decline. Not a single dramatic library burning night, more like repeated shocks to the city's ability to support major scholarly infrastructure. Now imagine the effect on scholars. A scholar does not need much to do research. Sometimes a few texts and quiet time are enough. But if the city is unstable, quiet time becomes rare. Also, copying requires materials. Materials require trade. Trade requires stability. So word doesn't just destroy. It interrupts. And interrupted copying is how loss spreads. Because if no one is making new copies, old scrolls become the only copies. And old scrolls die. So even if we can't point to a single moment and say, the library died here, we can say something more realistic. Repeated conflict and damage make long-term preservation much harder. Now another factor, administration. The older Ptolemaic world had a certain cultural mission tied to the dynasty. Later Roman administration might not share that mission in the same way. That does not mean Romans hated learning. Romans had libraries and scholars too. But priorities shift, and cultural projects tied to old dynasties can lose their special place. So by this era, the Library of Alexandria, as a powerful royal engine, may already have been a shadow of its earlier self. That doesn't mean nothing existed. It means the myth of a single perfect library surviving untouched until one final fire becomes harder to defend. This is the season of the story where the library becomes less like a shining monument and more like an aging machine. Still impressive, still meaningful, but vulnerable. And there's something oddly human about that. Because we all know what it's like when a project begins with excitement and later turns into maintenance mode. At first you say, "We will build the greatest library in the world." Later you say, "Please stop storing food next to the scrolls." That's real life. Now ledger time. What we know. Alexandria experienced serious unrest and conflict in later Roman periods, including episodes of urban damage. Institutions tied to elite districts can be vulnerable during citywide fighting. Repeated instability harms preservation indirectly by disrupting staff, funding, and copying networks. What is myth or uncertain? A precise battle moment where we can prove the main library collection was destroyed. Exact details of what survived in what building after each conflict. The idea that the library was either fully alive or fully dead. Reality is usually mixed. Next chapter, we reach a famous flashpoint, the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE. This is where history, religion, and politics collide, and where later storytelling becomes very loud. We'll keep it quiet and careful. This chapter is one of the most emotionally charged parts of the Alexandria story, because it touches religion, identity, and conflict. And when those things mix, later writers often sharpen their pens. So we're going to walk slowly. We're going to focus on what is solid, and we're going to treat dramatic claims like fragile glass. The Serapeum was a major temple complex in Alexandria, a big important site connected to Serapis, a deity associated with the city's cultural world. In the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was changing in major ways. Christianity had grown in power and influence. Old religious structures faced pressure, sometimes legal, sometimes social, sometimes violent. In 391 CE, the Serapeum was destroyed. That is the solid core. Now comes the question that people attach to the library myth. Was the Serapeum still holding a major book collection at that time? Was it the last library? Was it filled with the remaining scrolls of Alexandria's golden age? This is where we must be careful. Later sources and later retellings sometimes describe the Serapeum's destruction as if it was the final burning of the Library of Alexandria. But historians often point out that the library system likely changed long before 391. It may have declined, fragmented, moved, or weakened across centuries. So even if books existed at the Serapeum, it would not be surprising if some did. We cannot confidently say it contained the entire library, or even the most important core collection from earlier centuries. Also, book collection is not one thing. Temples and major complexes could contain archives, records, and texts, but the size, content, and status of those texts can vary widely. So when you hear, "They destroyed the library at the Serapeum," a calmer translation is, the Serapeum was destroyed, and it may have involved the loss of texts, but the exact relationship to the older Library of Alexandria is uncertain. Now, why does this become such a major myth magnet? Because it offers a clean moral story. One group is cast as villains. The other group is cast as victims. Or the reverse, depending on who is telling it. And the library becomes a symbol in someone else's argument. That's a problem. Because once a symbol enters a political fight, details get treated like optional. So we do the quiet thing instead. We admit what we can't fully prove. We also remember, Alexandria was a city of multiple communities. Not everyone experienced the same events the same way. And later writing can come from a position of pain, pride, propaganda, or defense. So the best approach is empathy plus evidence. Empathy, yes, this period involved real conflict and real loss. Evidence, the library myth is often bigger than what we can directly document. Now think of the library as a system again. By 391 CE, the system could already be deeply altered. Scholars might not be supported the same way. Collections might be scattered. Catalogs might not exist as they once did. And if that's true, then the Serapeum's destruction is not the end of the library, but one more major blow in a long chain of change. Still tragic. Still significant. Just not a simple finale. Now, gentle bedtime humor moment. People want history to be like a movie where the final boss appears, epic music plays, and then the credits roll. But history is more like a long TV show with cancellations, reboots, and missing episodes. Sometimes the finale isn't even labeled as a finale until years later. That's what happens with the Serapeum in the library myth. It gets turned into the ending because it fits a dramatic shape. So we keep the shape, but we keep it honest. We say, the Serapeum was destroyed. Texts may have been lost. But the idea that this was the single moment the Library of Alexandria died is not secure. Now ledger time. What we know. The Serapeum was a major complex in Alexandria and was destroyed around 391 CE. The late Roman period involved intense religious and political change, sometimes violent. It is plausible that texts existed in temple or institutional settings, and destruction could involve cultural loss. What is myth or uncertain? That the Serapeum definitely contained the entire Library of Alexandria at that time. That one clean act in 391 CE explains all the loss associated with the library legend. Many dramatic details that later sources may amplify for polemical reasons. Next chapter, we face one of the most repeated quotes in the whole story, the Arab conquest legend. It's famous, it's tidy, and it's very likely not as solid as people think. If you've ever looked up the Library of Alexandria online, you have probably seen a quote like this. If the books agree with the sacred text, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous. So burn them. It's the kind of quote that sounds like a perfect villain speech. Short, sharp, memorable. And because it's memorable, it spreads. This quote is often linked to the Arab conquest of Alexandria in the 7th century, sometimes tied to Caliph Umar. So the story becomes, Alexandria is captured. The remaining library is found. A decision is made. The books are burned. Clean ending. Tragic. Simple. And this is exactly why historians tend to be suspicious. Because the cleaner a story is, the more likely it is shaped for storytelling. Now, let's be gentle here. This is not about blaming modern people for repeating it. It's everywhere. It gets told like a fact. But many historians doubt this story for a few calm reasons. First, the sources for this tale often appear late compared to the events. When a story shows up much later, we have to ask if it's reporting memory or building a message. Second, the quote feels rhetorical. It feels like it was written to make a point, not to record an event. That doesn't prove it's false, but it raises the myth alarm. Third, by the time of the conquest, the original library system from the early Ptolemaic era likely had already changed dramatically, possibly for centuries. So the idea that a massive, intact Library of Alexandria was sitting there waiting to be discovered becomes harder to accept. That last point matters a lot. People imagine the library surviving like a hidden treasure vault for 900 years, untouched, and then suddenly being burned in one decision. But institutions don't usually sit frozen like that. They evolve, fragment, decline, relocate, rebuild. So even if texts were lost in this era, and texts could be lost in many ways, the idea of a single, gigantic bonfire ending the library is historically shaky. Now let's zoom out again. The Arab conquest of Alexandria was real history. Major political change happened. Administration changed. The city's role changed. That kind of transition can affect institutions. But the neat burn them all quote story is likely a later invention or exaggeration that serves someone's argument. It often functions as a moral tale, about faith versus learning, about conquest versus culture, about power versus books. And moral tales love simple villains. But real history is messy. Also, and this matters, knowledge transmission flourished in many parts of the Islamic world in later centuries. Translation movements, libraries, scholarship. So the idea that the conquest era is defined by burning books as policy does not fit the broader historical pattern in a simple way. That doesn't mean every ruler was a saint. It means the one-line villain quote is probably not a reliable summary of a whole civilization's relationship with learning. Now, here is a calm bedtime way to hold this. It is possible that books were lost during transitions, conflicts, or neglect. It is also possible that local collections existed and were dispersed. But the famous quote story is likely not solid evidence for a specific giant burning of the Library of Alexandria. And there's a deeper reason these stories multiply. Because people need an ending. If you believe the library was the greatest treasure on Earth, you want to know what happened to it. You want a final scene. But the honest answer might be, there wasn't one final scene. There were many scenes, many losses, many changes, and lots of quiet forgetting. That is less satisfying, but more realistic. Now, tiny humor again. We love the quote because it's short. But history almost never gives you a short quote that explains everything. If history were honest, the quote would be like, "Listen, we have administrative issues, supply problems, political tension, unclear inventories, and also I'm very tired. We'll deal with the books later." That sounds real. It also sounds like the least viral quote of all time. Now ledger time. What we know. Alexandria changed hands in the 7th century, and major transitions occurred. The famous agree/disagree, so burn them story is widely repeated but is not strongly supported by early, reliable evidence. By this era, the original library system had likely already changed greatly across centuries. What is myth or uncertain? The quote itself is a confirmed historical statement from the conquest period. The idea that a massive intact Library of Alexandria still existed then, waiting to be burned in one clean event. Any confident story that treats this as the single final ending of Alexandria's library legend. Next chapter is the comforting one. Not because the losses aren't real, but because the story of knowledge doesn't end where a building ends. We ask, what survived and how? After so many chapters about loss, you might feel a little heavy. So let's do something gentle now. Let's talk about survival. Because the Library of Alexandria is often treated like the one basket holding all eggs. And when the basket breaks, everything is gone. But knowledge is not always a single basket. Knowledge is often a flock of birds. It moves. Texts travel. Copies spread. Teachers carry ideas. Students remember methods. And even when a scroll dies, the content can live somewhere else. Now, we should be honest. A lot was lost in antiquity. Many works vanished. Many authors became names without books. But the story is not everything vanished. We still have a surprising amount of ancient material, and we often have it because of long chains of copying and transmission. So how did texts survive? One way, other libraries. Alexandria was famous, but it wasn't alone. There were other centers, cities, schools, private collections, later imperial libraries. Texts moved between them through trade, copying, and scholarly networks. Another way, communities. Religious communities, educational traditions, and local scholarly circles often preserved texts because they used them. Used texts get copied. Copied texts survive longer. Another way, translation. We talked about translation earlier, and now it returns as a hero. When a text is translated, it gains another life. It becomes readable in another world. It enters another library tradition. So even if one language culture experiences collapse, the translated text can continue. And then there's the biggest survival method of all. Boring persistence. People copying generation after generation. No dramatic music. No statues built in their honor. Just hands moving in lamplight. This is why the Library of Alexandria matters, even if it didn't contain everything. Because it symbolizes a kind of effort that did exist. The effort to collect, organize, and preserve. Even if the buildings and original system faded, the method and the ambition influenced later worlds. Now, let's deal with the big fear again. Did we lose ancient science that would have changed everything? Sometimes people claim the library had secret machines, advanced tech, hidden books that would have made us modern centuries earlier. That's a fun idea, but we should keep it calm. We do have evidence that ancient thinkers achieved impressive things. We also have evidence that many works are missing. So it's fair to say, we lost important material. But it's not safe to say. We lost a complete manual for modern technology. That's myth territory. The real tragedy is still real without that. The real tragedy is that many voices are gone. Many poems. Many histories. Many observations. Many experiments. But the real comfort is also real. Some voices survived, and sometimes they survive through strange routes. A text written in Greek might survive because it was copied in the Byzantine world, or because it was translated into Syriac, or because it was translated into Arabic during major translation movements, or later, translated into Latin and reintroduced into Western Europe. Transmission is messy, but it works. It's like a message passed hand to hand across a long night. Not every word stays perfect. Sometimes it changes. Sometimes parts are lost. But the message can still arrive. So when people say, the library burned and we lost everything, a calmer correction is, we lost a lot, but knowledge also moved through many channels. The story of survival is bigger than one city. And that is good news for bedtime, because it means the world is not only fragile, it is also stubborn. Now ledger time. What we know. Many ancient works were lost, but many also survived through copying and transmission across regions and languages. Translation and multi-center networks help knowledge persist beyond any one institution. The library's methods and scholarly habits likely influence broader traditions of preservation and study. What is myth or uncertain? That everything important was lost in one single event. That the library contains secret modern-level technology manuals. Any overly neat story that treats survival as a straight line rather than a messy web. Next chapter is our final landing. We ask why the library still matters, especially when the myth isn't perfectly true. Now we return to the harbor softly, not to a burning scene, not to smoke, just to night air and distant water. Because the Library of Alexandria, in the end, is not only a historical institution, it is a human symbol. It is the story we tell when we want to talk about loss without naming our own losses. It's the story we tell when we feel that knowledge is fragile. That memory is fragile. That culture can disappear. And that fear is not childish. It is realistic. Buildings fall. Wars happen. Budgets shrink. Politics changes. People stop caring. And when people stop caring, the future gets smaller. So the myth survives because it speaks to something true, even when the details are messy. The true thing is this. Knowledge needs protection, not just from fire, from neglect. And the library's story teaches that in a quiet way. It also teaches something else, that even the best projects are human. They depend on leaders who choose to support them. They depend on staff who show up. They depend on boring systems, catalogs, storage, copying. So if you love the Library of Alexandria, it's worth loving the unglamorous parts too. The librarians, the scribes, the organizers, the people who didn't get statues. Because if you want knowledge to last, those are the people you need. Now here is another reason the library matters. It represents a dream of gathering the world's voices together. Not to erase differences, but to understand them. Alexandria was a crossroads. Languages mixed. Texts moved. Ideas traveled. That is a hopeful image. And it's also a reminder that cultural exchange is older than we think. People have always borrowed, translated, argued, and learned from each other. Now let's bring the myth and the facts together in a gentle final shape. What we know is not as clean as the legend, but it is still beautiful. We know Alexandria was a major center of scholarship. We know it gathered and organized texts in ambitious ways. We know it influenced how people studied literature, math, and the world. We also know its story includes damage, decline, and loss over a long time. We don't have one final bonfire scene that explains everything. We have centuries of change, and that's okay, because the lesson becomes deeper. The lesson becomes, don't build one single treasure vault and assume it will last forever. Build networks. Make copies. Share knowledge widely, so no one fire can erase it. And look at us now. We're still telling the story, still asking questions, still separating what we know from what we wish. That means the library didn't fully disappear. Not as an institution, maybe, but as an idea. Now, modern life gives us new versions of the same problem. We have digital libraries. We have cloud storage. We have archives. We also have new threats, censorship, war, neglect, corporate shutdowns, data loss. Oops, I deleted the folder. So the library's story stays relevant because it warns us gently. Nothing stays safe by accident. Preservation is a choice. And the final comfort is this. Even when we lose things, humans keep trying again. They rebuild. They translate. They copy. They teach. They light a lamp and keep reading. So if you're listening to this and feeling sleepy, let that be your final image. Not flames. A lamp. Quiet room. A page unrolling. A mind staying curious, even when the world is dark. Now, the final ledger. What we know. The Library of Alexandria stands for a real historical world of ambitious scholarship and preservation efforts. Its decline was likely complex and stretched across multiple centuries and events. The idea of preservation through networks and copying is historically real and still relevant. What is myth or uncertain? A single clean ending that explains everything with one villain and one fire. Any story that uses the library only as a weapon in modern arguments, ignoring evidence and nuance. The fantasy that one perfect place can hold everything safely forever. And that's where we end. Not with a bang, with a soft light, with the harbor quiet again, and with a simple truth. What we know is enough to be amazed, and what we don't know can stay a gentle mystery.